To survive a war is a matter of armor, damage control, and operational geometry. To survive the peace is a matter of administrative physics. USS Enterprise CV-6 was the most decorated American warship of the Second World War. She earned 20 battle stars, a combat record that made her one of the central symbols of the Pacific War. Yet the moment the global conflict ended, her operational profile encountered an irreversible step. The carrier was immediately caught in the mechanism of administrative obsolescence. This is a process where combat legacy holds zero weight against the mathematics of modern aviation. Her subsequent removal from active service was not an act of institutional disrespect. It was a rigid application of engineering boundaries. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the fleet faced a rapid and brutal technological shift. Early jet-age aircraft and heavier post-war naval aircraft were moving the fleet toward a different engineering standard. These new airframes were heavier, carried greater fuel loads, and approached the deck at higher speeds. They required longer flight decks, stronger catapults, reinforced arresting gear, and higher capacity elevator mechanisms. Enterprise was a pre-war Yorktown-class design. Her structural architecture and displacement margins were permanently limited. Expanding her to meet the physical parameters of the incoming jet age meant cutting deep into a hull that had never been designed for that growth. This analysis established the technical gap between a decorated combat platform and a viable post-war modernization candidate. The newer and larger Essex-class carriers already in the fleet possessed the internal volume and displacement margins required to absorb these extensive aviation upgrades. Enterprise did not, so the modernization review moved directly from engineering comparison to administrative removal from combat status. The ship was formally decommissioned on February 17, 1947. Under standard naval asset management procedure, an obsolete hull with zero modernization potential is rapidly discarded. The objective is to immediately eliminate all unnecessary maintenance draw, but the sheer weight of her historic record generated intense friction against standard operational procedure. High-level political interventions attempted to bypass the engineering logic. As early as 1945, Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal recognized the carrier's extraordinary historical value and supported the idea that she should be treated as more than disposable steel. He sought to place a heritage boundary around the ship, identifying her as an irreplaceable artifact of the Pacific War. High-level political sympathy kept the preservation idea alive and formed a fragile protective perimeter around the ship, but it did not create federal law or continuous maintenance funding. The Department of the Navy operated under a strict institutional policy of post-war budget consolidation. The active fleet was shrinking rapidly, and every remaining dollar was prioritized for future combat readiness. Maintaining an inactive and obsolete hull requires constant financial output. The military must pay for cathodic protection to prevent underwater corrosion, security details to prevent unauthorized access, structural monitoring to ensure watertight integrity, and basic mooring infrastructure. The Navy engineering and financial command structures made a cold, necessary calculation. They determined that spending active fleet funds to preserve a non-operational legacy asset directly compromised the readiness of the surviving force. The institutional boundary was absolute. The military apparatus exists to project combat power, not to curate inactive heritage sites or fund maritime museums. Under the preservation framework that eventually emerged, the burden would have to be carried outside the normal active fleet budget, regardless of her 20 battle stars. The executive request from the President and the Secretary of the Navy therefore created a bureaucratic stalemate, enough authority to slow disposal but not enough to secure the ship. The ship was trapped in a state of suspended animation, safe from immediate destruction but denied the resources required to secure her future. This deadlock left the carrier moored and degrading, waiting for an external solution. If the President of the United States could not bypass the strict budget boundary of the Navy by executive suggestion, the fundamental question remained of what legal mechanism possibly could. In August 1957, Public Law 85-218 altered the deadlock by conditionally authorizing transfer of the vessel to the USS Enterprise Association as a permanent memorial museum. The law turned preservation into a private capital test. Within a 6-month window, the association had to prove $1 million scale funding base, a viable site, and the ability to support the ship without expense to the United States or the District of Columbia. The Department of the Navy, operating under heavy pressure to clear inactive inventory, hardened this legislative boundary into an active operational restriction. The military command converted that boundary into an upfront cost test. This included complex drydock repairs to stabilize the hull for static display, complete preservation of the internal compartments to a safe civilian standard, and the execution of a high-risk towing operation to the proposed display berth in the national capital. In addition, the proposed display site near the national capital created major approval, berthing, and site preparation problems, all of which added to the financial burden the civilian group had to prove it could carry. To enforce this requirement, the Navy set an immovable deadline. They granted a strict 6-month time frame to secure the total required capital and finalize the transfer infrastructure. This aggressive schedule turned preservation into a race against commercial shipbreaking. The association had to raise $1 million to $2 million from private donations, while the Navy prepared disposal paperwork and refused to carry the inactive hull on its operational budget. The federal parameters left no phased restoration path, no bridge loan, and no deferred dredging option. The money, site, and transfer infrastructure had to be verified before title could move. Confronted with an impossible timeline and a complete federal funding freeze, the question became who would even attempt to evaluate the hull and coordinate a rescue. The immediate decision by military planners to formally strike the vessel from the active reserve list generated a rapid and aggressive organizational response. By the mid-1950s, former crew members and supporters recognized the impending disposal threat and organized through the USS Enterprise Association. This was a dedicated civilian organization designed to work through the legal transfer process and map a direct preservation pathway. The mobilization quickly gained massive high-level operational support. Fleet Admiral William Halsey directly engaged with the campaign. He utilized his extensive public profile to legitimize the civilian effort and drive the preservation assessment forward. Earlier proposals had already failed, leaving the association to operate without state-level backing or federal maintenance authority. Its campaign became a private preservation assessment, not a publicly secured museum project. To formulate a viable preservation strategy, the civilian planners had to establish the condition baseline of the carrier. This engineering concept represents the fundamental starting point for any ship transition. Warships are designed with specific, finite structural fatigue limits. A combat vessel subjected to continuous wartime operational tempos suffers deep, microscopic wear across all primary load-bearing structures. High-speed evasive maneuvers, localized blast damage, continuous structural vibration from heavy aviation machinery, and the sheer cyclical stress of launching and recovering heavy aircraft all permanently degrade the physical steel. The condition baseline measures this accumulated wear penalty. Every year, a heavily abused ship sits inactive in a deep water mooring without comprehensive drydock maintenance. This baseline continuously degrades. The civilian surveyors were evaluating a ship that spent years operating in extreme Pacific environments. Calculating the condition baseline meant analyzing the severe difference between a pristine reserve hull and a vessel worn down by maximum stress deployments. The hull framing, the flight deck supports, the underwater plating, and the internal bulkhead seals all required strict evaluation to ensure they could safely support thousands of civilian visitors over decades of display. The engineering reality of a heavily abused combat ship dictates that standard safety margins vanish rapidly. Water intrusion becomes a constant, creeping threat. The civilian assessment team could accurately map these physical vulnerabilities, but mapping a hazard is entirely different from having the industrial capacity to neutralize it. While attempting to solve this engineering puzzle, the association achieved a significant administrative victory. Its structure, its interface with military bureaucracies, and its request for external preservation control helped form the legal template for later civilian ship transfers. But that template did not supply the missing capital. The group could define a path to custody, but it could not finance the repairs, renovation, berthing, and long-term maintenance required to make the carrier safe. That failure left the final question on the steel itself. The physical geometry of a decommissioned fleet carrier created the intact hull liability. Enterprise was smaller and older than the Essex-class vessels dominating the active reserve fleet. yet still large enough to impose industrial-scale preservation costs. A combat ship of this immense tonnage is never a passive object. Even moored and inactive, the incredible surface area of the steel hull is under constant attack from saltwater corrosion, destructive galvanic action, and relentless atmospheric moisture. The vast internal volume of the carrier contained miles of complex piping, dense electrical conduits, and massive unlit boiler spaces. Without constant, heavily funded climate control and preventative maintenance routines, these dark internal voids rapidly invite advanced oxidation and inevitable structural collapse. When the flow of active maintenance capital completely ceases, the coherent main structure immediately transitions from a strategic combat asset into tens of thousands of tons of unfunded, continuously decaying mass. Visual evidence across the primary hull body confirmed that the flight deck structure, aircraft elevator platforms, and hangar bulkheads were not museum-ready. They would require industrial stabilization before any public display plan could be credible. The problem was not cosmetic. The carrier had to be stabilized as a complete public structure. This harsh structural reality ended any non-intrusive preservation theory. Stabilization required heavy industrial work. Ship fitters would need to extensively cut away compromised exterior steel plates, replace weakened internal framing deep within the engineering spaces, and completely seal the lower underwater sections of the hull to prevent catastrophic flooding at a future civilian mooring. The preservation mechanism broke at that point. With no capacity to resolve the physical decay of the intact hull, the preservation track collapsed. Administrative protection fell away, and Enterprise was reclassified as raw industrial scrap for transfer to the commercial salvage market. The United States government officially sold the vessel to the Lipset Corporation for shipbreaking operations. Contemporary reporting placed the final commercial sale price for the steel of the most decorated American warship of the Second World War at $561,333. The obsolete carrier was then readied for its final transit. The structure was towed away for total commercial dismantling. If the intact main hull was permanently condemned to the ship-breaking yards in Kearney, what detached fragments of the ship actually managed to escape the torch? Industrial shipbreaking is governed by cutting schedules, crane access, worker safety, and scrap value. Any off-hull artifact has to be identified, funded, rigged, and removed before the yard's teardown sequence overtakes it. Enterprise's main tripod mast was proposed for preservation, possibly for relocation to the Naval Academy. But the plan failed. The surviving record confirms the outcome, not a detailed scene of how the mast was handled inside the yard. Once an intact warship enters a commercial breaking slipway, it ceases to function as a coherent vessel and begins to move through a rapid industrial dismantling process. Detached fragments, isolated mechanical components, and architectural artifacts can survive only if they are removed early, handled safely, and separated from the normal scrap stream. That extraction pattern is not dictated by historical value alone. It is shaped by access, rigging risk, storage space, contract terms, and money. The mast failure showed the practical rule. Without pre-negotiated authority and money to cover a yard's added time and risk, large artifact extraction becomes unlikely once dismantling begins. Despite the chaotic and rapid destruction of the upper superstructure, a very narrow debris field of detached components did successfully exit the commercial yard. A few specific pieces were targeted and extracted early before the heavy structural teardown accelerated into the lower decks. The massive steel stern plate, prominently bearing the name of the vessel, was successfully isolated. Shipyard crews cut the surrounding steel, rigged the heavy plate clear of the primary scrap pile, and loaded it for transport. This heavy architectural plate was ultimately relocated to Rivervale, New Jersey, where it survived as a local memorial artifact. Additionally, smaller, easily handled items were acquired before the heavy torches reached them. The surviving artifact record is scattered rather than centered on a single successor ship. The ship's bell has been recorded at Naval Air Training Command in Corpus Christi, while at least one porthole has been recorded in the National Naval Aviation Museum collection. Other small pieces survived through individual removals, donations, and museum custody rather than through the survival of the carrier itself. The fragment record therefore answers the salvage question narrowly and raises the larger legacy question. Did the failed rescue matter at all? The total destruction of Enterprise became the warning that sharpened later preservation campaigns. Its failed million-dollar scale rescue effort contrasted with the successful campaign for the battleship North Carolina, which raised $250,000 in a different legal, political, and physical context. The sight of an irreplaceable Pacific war carrier being cut down stripped away the assumption that combat fame alone could protect a ship, creating the operational urgency that helped shape the 1960s museum ship fleet. This painful loss moved directly into procedure for future preservation organizations. They moved earlier, targeted ships in better structural condition, and tried to secure legal transfer before the steel baseline deteriorated beyond repair. North Carolina's cheaper preservation cost reflected that changed timing, and later civilian groups adopted aggressive fundraising as soon as a notable ship approached final decommissioning. Because of this final historical outcome, there is no intact USS Enterprise site to manage in the way a wreck site or surviving museum ship would be managed. The primary structure no longer exists in coherent form, so there is no submerged wreck to monitor, no flooded hull to survey, and no protected maritime zone to secure from unauthorized intrusion. The only remaining physical legacy exists as a scattered group of detached artifacts, preserved in local memorials, museums, naval commands, and private or institutional collections. That total structural loss became the boundary lesson that helped protect the remaining historical fleet.